Hello, please. Yeah, what's the problem, sir? We just drove down our farm track. Yeah. Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it. Yeah. It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over.
On the 6th of December 1995 in Rettendon, Essex, 2 farmers stumbled upon the aftermath of the most infamous gangland hit in the UK since the Kray twins. The blue Range Rover was found down a dirt track. Inside were the bodies of Tony Tucker, aged 38, Pat Tate, aged 37, and Craig Rolfe, aged 26. Each of them had been shot at point blank range. Due to their faces being so distorted, if it hadn't been for their fingerprints, they wouldn't have been identified. Let's get into the story of the Range Rover murders. In the 1990s, new laws meant Essex nightclubs could stay open late. This would be the era that techno music and ecstasy pills exploded onto the British music scene. Love affairs began between young partygoers and ecstasy pills, also known as the love drug. Dealers found raves an easy target to distribute pills to make large amounts of money. Clubs began to stage legal raves, and with the raves came the drugs, and with the drugs came gangwars. Tony Tucker was a security entrepreneur and supplied security for Raquel's nightclub in Basildon. It would be this very town that gave birth to the infamous Essex Boys. Tony, Pat and Craig were destined to go down as underworld legends. As well as controlling security, Tony controlled the drug trade and used Raquel's as a place to distribute ecstasy pills. With it being a love drug, it meant it stopped any violence. This was handy for the dealers and for Tony as it kept the police away. He would only use approved dealers that the doormen would allow in. They paid him for protection within the club, which made him a powerful player. With his newfound wealth and status, he bought an expensive house in rural Essex and began mingling with the celebrities. He became personal security for the Dart Destroyer Nigel Benn, the middleweight boxing champion. Nigel Benn held world championships in 2 weight classes, including the WBO middleweight title in 1990 and the WBC super middleweight title from 1992 to 1996. He attended boxing events with Nigel and ended up becoming good friends with him.
I went training up to Tenerife, they were there, and they actually done a running with me up Mount Tate, so it was great to see them actually running with me, and they were there for me, not as like, you know, a lot of people want to, just wannabes want to hang around with you so they can get you in freebie this and freebie that. They wasn't there, they paid their way. I never gave them a penny, not 1 penny.
Pat Tate was an ambitious giant. He saw the money that could be made in the drugs trade and convinced Tony that selling ecstasy pills was only making a few £1,000s a week and they should be making more. Tony and Craig agreed, and this is when the downhill slope began. They began not only selling but taking the drugs as well. Friends started to see the changes in them and described them as being like strangers. On one occasion, the gang tried to take a cut of the profits from a cannabis operation run by Billy Blundell, a well-known criminal in the underworld.
Injecting people up and throwing them in ditches to die and things like that, which they did, you know, so they were the worst of the worst. So, you know, you couldn't afford to take chances with them. They had to go.
They thought they could bully their way to get what they wanted and could take down anyone who got in their way. But Pat ended up having his jaw broke by Billy's right-hand man and they left without a penny. They were getting out of control, with them being heavy into heroin and other hardcore drugs and having a thirst to expand their business. They were ruthless to enemies and even friends. One of their dealers, Kevin Whitaker, lost money and this infuriated Pat and Tony. Unfortunately, he would end up paying with his life. A source claimed that they kidnapped him and gave him what they called the gang treatment. He claimed they put a lethal cocktail of drugs, including steroids and heroin, into a syringe and injected him with it. This would cause him to die. Craig took his lifeless body out of the car and threw it into a ditch. The police deemed it a suicide. When the word spread about this horrific crime, it put fear into the people of Essex. Old friends were becoming new enemies. Steve Nipper Ellis would be the next on the list.
And I just remember saying, Pat, you're nothing but a junkie, you're nothing more a junkie. And he's gone, Nipper, I control the drugs don't control me, I mean you're a junkie.
After seeing what the drugs were doing to Pat, Nipper decided to confront Pat about it, and it didn't go down well. A very enraged Pat and Tucker didn't need any excuses to make someone their next victim, so they put a plan together. Nipper was in his home when Tony and Craig burst through the door. Tony brandished a meat cleaver and grabbed Nipper by the throat. He lifted him and threw him on the bed. With a crazed look in his eyes, he looked at Nipper and said, "Your hand or your foot." Luckily for Nipper, Tony didn't cut his hand off that day. He left the house, taking whichever items of Nipper's he could. Disturbingly, Craig wiped excrement all over the walls before leaving. Nipper knew full well that this wouldn't be the end, and he was right. Tony, Pat and Craig were already making plans to torture and kill him and were making threats to his family. He decided to take matters into his own hands. Whilst driving around with his girlfriend, he drove past Pat's house and noticed his car was parked outside. He drove his girlfriend home and went back to Pat's bungalow. He had been to Pat's before, so he knew the layout. As he was outside scoping the house, he could see Pat's silhouette through the bathroom window. He crept through the garden with a rock in one hand and a gun in the other. He threw the rock through the bathroom window, which revealed Pat stood looking shocked in the middle of having a shave. Nipper quickly raised the gun and fired a shot at Pat, but at first it didn't go off. On the third squeeze, a bullet left the gun and entered Pat's arm. He quickly escaped into the dark whilst Pat phoned the police. He was then taken to hospital and had to stay there for a few days. The Essex boys had been attacked and they weren't going to let Nipper get away with it. They decided to lure Nipper into the hospital to settle the feud and put it in the past. They knew that this would be a good chance, as Nipper wouldn't think any harm would come to him in a public place like a hospital. Pat put a handgun under the sheet on his bed and they waited for him to arrive. Fortunately for Nipper, before they could execute the plan, one of the nurses changing the bedding on Pat's bed discovered the gun and reported it to the police. Pat was already on parole for a robbery he had taken part in, so he was recalled to prison for 18 months for breaching conditions. In prison, it had been rumoured that there was an inmate going around thieving from the other cellmates. A few days later, whilst having lunch, Pat and another inmate, John Worms, were walking back to their cells. They came up the steps and noticed the inmate accused of thieving had been beaten up and was lying on the floor. He asked the lads what they were doing. They looked at Pat and said, "He's been stealing off us." Pat said, "No, I mean that's not how you do it." He then went into his cell and grabbed a glass bottle of tomato ketchup. He smashed the bottle and stuck it in the inmate's face and twisted it. After this sickening attack, he then picks him up off the floor and throws him over a balcony off the top wing. With a chilling look on his face, he turns round and says, "That's how you do it, boys." Another example of the monster he was turning into. Being locked up didn't stop him from controlling his drugs operation on the outside, and whilst having time to think, he decided that him and his gang should be making more money with less chance of being caught. Pat wanted to move on to importing drugs. This is where we meet Micky Steele. He was a big time drug smuggler and also one of Pat's closest friends. He trusted him so much so that when Pat was in prison, he gave Micky around £23,000 and told him to give it to Sarah, his girlfriend, and their son if they needed anything whilst he was locked up. Sarah and Pat had been together for years, on and off, and had got pregnant whilst he was on a day release from prison. She had stuck by Pat and truly loved him and loved how he doted on their son. She saw a side that no one else saw. It wouldn't be long before Pat was out of prison and going on drug-fueled binges again. Sarah saw how much he had changed and was thinking of taking their son and leaving, but she was too scared. The relationship would come to an end after they got into a big altercation after a party that Tony had thrown for Pat. He told Sarah she was no longer welcome in his house and had better be gone by the time he got back. She phoned one of her friend's partners who lived a few streets away and asked if he would help Sarah gather some things before Pat came home. He didn't want to get involved, but his girlfriend pleaded with him to help. So he helped gather some of Sarah's belongings and she stayed with them that night. Pat found out about her friend's partner going round and helping her and immediately began to accuse them of having an affair and blaming him for their breakup. Pat, Tony and Craig jumped in the car and tracked him down. They kidnapped him off the street and put him through a traumatic ordeal at Pat's house. They held a knife to his throat and wrapped up 6 lines of cocaine and demanded he snorted it all. He knew he had no chance of saying no, so he complied. After sniffing so much cocaine, it caused him to pass out. Once he was unconscious, they stripped his clothes off and began to put cigarettes out on his body until he came round. Again, they would make him do more lines until he passed out. This went on for a while until they ran out of drugs. Tony and Craig told Pat that he had had enough. They put him in the boot of their car and drove him back to his house and left him naked and broken in his front garden. After this terrifying ordeal, he had to go to a psychiatric ward for 3 days. His girlfriend returned home and found him laying shaking in their living room, crying and struggling to breathe due to the powder in his nose. He was too scared to press charges, so Pat, Tony and Craig had got away with torturing another man and made another enemy. Pat needed money quick when he got out of prison, and he agreed to deal with Micky Steele importing cannabis. In order to make the deal, he had to borrow some money. Allegedly, he borrowed £40,000 off the Mullock brothers and promised to pay him back after the sale. The imported cannabis was of poor quality, and when customers started complaining to Pat, he was enraged. He confronts Micky about the cannabis, and Micky pays Pat the £40,000 back. But Pat had already decided he didn't want to pay the 40k back, so he tells the Mullock brothers that Micky hadn't paid and promised he will make him beg for forgiveness on his knees and then kill him in front of the Mullock brothers. Mick obviously wasn't happy hearing that Pat was going round threatening his life, and again he had made another enemy. The next account is from Darren Nicholl's testimony. Darren met Mick and Jack Holmes whilst in prison. When the three got out, they remained friends. Darren was arrested for being in possession of drugs, and whilst being interviewed by the police, he agreed to tell them what happened on the night of December 6, 1995. He says with Micky hearing what Pat's plans were, he came up with his own plan. He offered for Pat to enter a deal importing cocaine. He told Pat it would make them a lot of money. With Pat being thirsty for more money and power, he agreed. Micky told Tony, Pat and Craig where the deal had been taking place, and told them he wanted to do a quick run the night before to make sure everything ran smoothly. On the snowy night, the four of them got into the Range Rover and headed down Workhouse Lane. As they drove down Workhouse Lane, they arrived at a gate which was closed. Micky offered to get out and open it. Once out of the car, he retrieved the shotgun what he had planted, and Jack Holmes, who was lying in wait, waited for the signal. The two of them snuck up to the car and opened fire. Tony, Pat and Craig was each shot in the face at point blank range, and Pat was shot in his side which pierced through his liver. They obviously never expected it and was calm before the shooting. Craig still had his hands on the wheel and Pat had his phone in his hand. After shooting them, he had Darren Nicholl, who believed he was there just for a drugs deal, waiting to drive them away from the scene. Darren claimed Jack got into the back seat wearing a pair of white surgical gloves covered in blood and had blood spatter all over him. Micky got into the car, also covered in blood spatter, who demanded Darren drive away. He said the pair were laughing about Jack's shotgun falling apart and that Micky was saying he was an angel of death. 3 years after the murder of the Essex boys, Micky Steele and Jack Holmes were found guilty and were sentenced to life in prison. There was no DNA, no evidence, but the jury found them guilty due to Darren's testimony. Darren was given a new identity and a place to live and has remained anonymous ever since. Jack Holmes was freed from prison in March 2022 for good behaviour, but Micky Steele is still serving his sentence. Since 1995, there have been thousands of theories on who did it, and many believe Micky and Jack are innocent. The Essex boys had made so many enemies in so many places that there will be a lot of people that will have done it. Who do you think did it? Comment down below what you really think happened. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this type of content, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.